want to bring it up then, you are welcome to. All right, so I'm going to open indicator 6. I know the preschool special education team led by Jody Beal, who's typically with us on the panel and is participating virtually. She and her team are with us. So certainly would welcome them if they have things to add, questions that I can't answer, or anything that I might misstate or misrepresent. I encourage them to jump in and clarify. But I'll certainly do my best here with our preschool indicators. So indicator 6, preschool LRE, it is specific to those students with disabilities ages 3 through 5 who are in preschool. So we do have some 5-year-olds who are in preschool. They count with this indicator. And as we said, those 5-year-olds in kindergarten now count for the first time with the last indicator we looked at, school age LRE. Indicator 6 newly has 3 measurements, just like indicator 5. It used to only have 2. As we'll look at, it also has a new 3rd measure. So the first part then, it follows, kind of indicator 5 and going from like more inclusive, right, to more restrictive. It takes that same approach. The first part of indicator 6 looks at those children with IEPs in preschool who are attending a regular early childhood program and receiving the majority of their services in that regular early childhood program. And then 6B looks at those who are served in a separate special education class, a separate school, or a residential facility. And then the new part of indicator 6 looks at those preschool children with IEPs who are receiving their services in the home. So pointing out, a few data notes here as an extension of our last indicator. We now took all of those 5-year-olds in kindergarten, right, who used to count with this indicator, and we've moved them to, as required, to school age. So that does affect this indicator, as we'll look at in a few important ways when we look at the data. Also the home piece, right, being new. Home is one of those categories that has been required to be reported in the child count, just as the category Tammy mentioned for school age, or I'm sorry, Trisha mentioned for school age. Got to give credit where it's due. But home was not previously part of the indicator, so it's newly added to the indicator. So we've never set targets for students in the home before, and now we have to. Just like with indicator 5, preschool students count with their legal district of residence, regardless of where their services are provided. It's really important to note because of the way preschool works in Ohio, right? We have a lot of preschool programs that are run by our educational service centers. We have a range of school districts who join into a consortia and are part of those, certainly to consolidate resources in more rural areas, to form preschool classes, lots of good reasons. But it's worth noting that each of those students counts with their legal district of residence, even if they attend preschool at the ESC. A separate education class is defined as a preschool special education program that consists of 51% or more of students with disabilities. So if it doesn't meet that 50-50 model, then if it's a 51% or higher rate of students with disabilities, it's considered a separate special education class. And just like with school age, LRE, we want to note that these targets may not reflect, right, the full continuum of needs and placement options at a given district level. They are statewide targets. All right, so we have a few, programmatic considerations, particularly the new preschool rule. Definitely, I know the preschool team feels strongly that this gives leverage that perhaps we haven't had before to further encourage, more inclusion when it comes to how preschool, services are provided, how preschool instruction is provided. And so we'll look at our data as well. And then, of course, we do have a couple of grants mentioned here that are also geared at early childhood inclusion. So just like with indicator 5, let's take a look at how we performed relative to the nation as a whole. I do want to note that these are the 1920 data, the most recently available national data. You'll see a different picture when we get to 2021 because of all those 5-year-olds in kindergarten being taken out. So we'll look at that next. But first, let's celebrate, right, that we are substantially outperforming the nation, or we were, right? When all those 5-year-olds in kindergarten were included, we were at a 73.66% of preschool children in a regular classroom compared to only 43.75% nationally. And then, of course, we see that same trend in separate settings, right? We were at only 16.2% compared to 26% nationally. And then lastly, talk about the small fraction, right? When we look at students served in the home in the 1920 year, we were at only a 1.57% compared to over 2% nationally. So, it gets real close in those small numbers, but certainly outperforming the nation on 6A and 6B with our prior calculation. So then, keeping that in mind, let's look at our most recent data in addition to how we've performed over time. So prior to the change in calculation, this indicator was absolutely like the epitome of like steady growth upward every year. Definitely that upward trajectory was playing out. Starting from a 61.7% in 14-15, steady growth every year. Until the change in calculation. And this is really where we see that impact. So for the 2021 year, not only does our denominator decrease, by a lot, right? Going down from 27,487 down to just over 19,000, but particularly the numerator, right? When all of those 5-year-olds who by and large were being served inside the regular classroom, when they could be counted in 6A, we had a higher rate. And now that they are removed and we're really looking at what's happening for preschool children, right? Actual preschool children, not 5-year-olds in kindergarten. I think the preschool team would argue it paints a truer picture, though. Even though the data are lower, it's a more accurate picture of what is happening in Ohio in preschool. So it does take us down to a 66.8%. That is the impact of the change in calculation. There's a data note that I think I skipped over that's important, so I want to just scroll back up quickly. Right here, how did I miss it? So the other thing that we can't separate from the change in calculation when we look at a smaller denominator is the impact of the pandemic on preschool enrollment. It decreased by almost 45% statewide during the pandemic. So that absolutely, affects the total number of children being included, being counted in this indicator. Okay, so then building on our graph of performance over time, let's look at how we performed in relation to our prior targets. It's all green, right? Prior to the change in calculation, with our old targets, you can see they were very conservative, right? In fact, they held steady at a 52.3 for several years. I think there was, the thought at that time was that there was a lot of volatility in the data, a lot of needing to establish consistency. That's still a journey, right, in terms of how regular early childhood classrooms are reported and so on. So we met or exceeded, those targets every year because of our steady upward growth. So with that in mind, we know our baseline is, new, right, because of the new calculation. So it is that 66.81%. That will be our starting place. We have to exceed that by the final year. So option A keeps us at the 66.81%. 0.81% for this current year. Just, I think, the idea of, getting the handle on what's happening, right, as a result of the pandemic, and then starts to show growth each year, ending at a 74% in 25-26. So it would then, that would sort of get us back to the rate we were at before the change in calculation, is the idea there. Getting to that 74% would require, over 1,300 more preschool children to attend regular early childhood programs in Ohio. So then, in comparison, option B starts, that improvements at a higher rate and sooner, reflects 3 percentage points, and then from 76 all the way up to an 80% by 25-26. So to reach that 80%, that would require 2,500 more preschool children to attend regular early childhood programs, in comparison to the 1,300 for the 74%. Okay, let's keep moving here to 6B. Now we're going to switch gears, and these are more restrictive, so we want to be at or below the targets, and so this is our separate settings measure at the preschool level. Includes those separate classes and separate facilities. We can see the change in calculation does show an increase, not surprisingly, right? Because more of the students who remain in the calculation are in those separate preschool classes in particular. So we're up to almost a 19% with the change in calculation. Looking at our prior targets, we across the board met and exceeded those, just like we did with 6A with the prior calculation. So our options here, similar, to 6A, option A for 6B keeps us, at the 18.94% for a few years in recognition of the pandemic, and then starts to go down from there in smaller increments, getting down though to a 16% by 25-26. That would require almost 560 more preschool children to move to less restrictive environments. By comparison, option B starts this year dropping to an 18%, and then 2 percentage points each year, ending at a 10% for the 25-26 school year. To get to that 10%, we would need almost 1,700 more preschool children to move to less restrictive environments. Okay, and then our last part, new part. So it takes us a little bit to get used to this new measure since it's never been part of the indicator before. Looking at preschool children receiving their services at home, a couple things to note. We do see an increase, not surprisingly, during the 2021 school year, going up from a 1.57% to nearly 3%, certainly reflective, right, of the pandemic, more families and parents preferring to have their children at home and get their services there, understandably, feeling like that was a safer option for their children. So still a small subset, but an expected increase statewide. So only 566 total, but a jump for sure from the prior year. So this is where target setting gets real tough. It's sort of a head scratcher, frankly, for states, about why insist upon this being part of the indicator and setting targets when the percentage is so small, right, to begin with. But it is here, and so we do need to determine targets for the first time. that are considered rigorous yet attainable. So our baseline is this higher rate, right? So we might expect it to come down as we get past the pandemic, if more families feel comfortable, letting their children attend special education classes or regular early childhood preschool programs, right? We might see this go back down. But option A, takes the approach of we don't know for sure how soon it might come back down. So we'll stay at the higher rate and then show a steady decrease, getting us back, right, to that 1.55%, so below where we left off before the pandemic. And that would require over 270 preschool children to move from the home into a less restrictive environment. By comparison, option B would start that growth sooner and would get down to only a 1%, right? So lower than that 1.55. Getting there would require 376 children to move from the home to less restrictive preschool environments. All right, that is our preschool LRE. Looking at our time here, I think we're fine to pause for a minute before we switch gears into preschool outcomes. And that one will be a lot, right? It is a lot of measures, but they do, it follows a very similar pattern. But before we do that, are there questions, thoughts, ideas about